Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Oh,
Today we're going to be looking at recycled water in Abu Dhabi.
interesting.
Yeah, you sent over a whole bunch of documents on this
Yeah.
regulatory frameworks, tariff structures, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
So we're going to be trying to figure out how Abu Dhabi is looking towards sustainable water
Right. Yeah.
and what their approach is.
It's really interesting because it's not just about, building treatment plants. It's about creating a whole new sector.
The whole new way of thinking about recycled water.
Yeah.
But before we get into all of that,
Right.
let's set the scene a little bit.
Okay.
So Abu Dhabi has split their recycled water system into production and distribution.
Yeah. Kind of like a marketplace.
Okay.
So you've got ADSSC, Abu Dhabi Sewage Services Company. They handle the production side.
Right. So they're the ones actually treating the wastewater and turning it into the usable water.
Exactly. And then on the other side, you've got the distributors,
Right.
ADC and ADDC.
Al Ain Distribution Company and Abu Dhabi Distribution Company.
Yeah. Those guys, they're the ones that get it to the customers.
So they're like the retailers.
Exactly like the retailers.
And ADSSC is the wholesaler.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that analogy.
And what's interesting is these distributors, they're operating in a newly regulated environment.
Okay.
They got their licenses in November 2017,
Wow.
which was a big shift for the sector. And the Department of Energy, the DOE, they stepped in as the regulator.
Okay, so this is where it starts to get a little bit complicated.
Yeah.
Because the documents that you sent over mentioned some pretty serious challenges when it came to unbundling the sector.
Right.
So imagine you're buying a house, but the seller doesn't really have a clear inventory of what's included.
Uh-huh.
That's basically what ADC and ADDC faced
Wow.
when they had to acquire all these assets.
Yeah.
All the pipes, pumping stations, everything
A fave.
from ADSSC and the municipality.
It's like a giant puzzle
Yeah.
they have to put together.
They inherited a big water-themed jigsaw puzzle.
Exactly. And it's still conducting asset surveys,
Yeah.
working on a comprehensive asset register.
So they're building the plane as they fly it.
It's a massive undertaking. On top of all that, they have to figure out how to pay for it.
Right, the money.
The money trail.
Yeah, how does that work?
So they've got this two-tiered tariff system.
Okay.
ADSSC sets a wholesale price for the treated water
Yeah.
based on their production cost.
Okay.
And then the distributors set retail tariffs for their customers.
So it's kind of like the cost of treating the water
Yeah,
plus the cost of getting it to your tap
exactly.
all rolled into one.
All in one.
Okay.
But, I bet the DOE keeps a close eye on those prices.
Yeah, they have to, right?
Yeah, they review and finalize both the wholesale and retail tariffs.
Okay.
They want to make sure that the water is affordable for customers,
Okay.
but also allows the sector to actually grow and thrive.
Makes sense.
And remember, their goal is to promote sustainable water management.
Right.
So they're also using these tariffs to encourage people to use more recycled water.
Okay, so the DOE is really taking an active role here in shaping this sector.
Absolutely. They are like the referees.
Yeah.
They're making sure the game is played fairly. So they're ensuring that the sector is financially viable,
Right.
that the costs are recovered efficiently,
Yeah.
and that customers aren't being taken advantage of.
Right.
One of the key tools that they use is something called multi-year CPIX revenue controls.
Multi-year CPIX?
I know it sounds complicated,
Okay.
but it's actually simpler than it sounds.
Okay.
It's basically a cap on how much revenue the distributors can earn,
Okay.
and it's adjusted each year based on inflation, that's the CPI part,
Okay.
and an X factor for other adjustments.
So they're trying to balance the affordability for customers with the need for these companies to actually make money and grow.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this revenue model, it's built on three main things: operating expenditures,
Cheers.
regulatory depreciation, and return on capital.
Okay, so let's break those down
Yeah.
one by one.
Okay.
So first up, OPEX. What kind of costs are we talking about?
So initially, they plan to base the object's projections on the costs from 2018.
Yeah.
But there was a problem. These businesses were so new back then
Right.
that those costs weren't really representative
Yeah.
of what a mature, fully operational company would spend.
Made sense.
So they needed a different approach.
They did.
Yeah, and they ended up focusing on four key components:
Okay.
manpower, outsourced operation and maintenance contracts,
Right.
consultant fees for assessing the network,
Right.
and shared costs with other utility businesses.
Okay, so manpower, that makes sense.
Uh-huh.
Operations and maintenance contracts, I imagine that covers repairs and upkeep of pipes and pumps.
Exactly.
What about the consultant fees, though?
Well, remember that giant puzzle we talked about?
The water puzzle.
They needed experts to come in and tell them what they had,
Right.
what needed to be done.
Okay.
And the shared costs come in because ADC and ADDC,
Yeah.
they also manage other utilities like electricity and water,
Right.
so they have to allocate a portion of those costs to the recycled water.
Okay, that sounds really complicated.
It is a lot of number crunching,
Yeah.
but it's important to get it right.
Are there any examples of these OPEX challenges?
ADDC had to competitively tender operation and maintenance contracts
Yeah.
across different regions.
Wow.
It wasn't easy because they're dealing with this vast network of assets
Right.
that they didn't build.
Yeah, it's not just about setting a price. It's about managing a whole web of different services and contracts.
Exactly.
And I imagine the DOE is watching all of this,
Oh, yeah, they're watching everything.
making sure it's done efficiently and fairly.
Right.
They're even benchmarking the distributor's OPEX against the cost of just water distribution.
Yeah, they want to make sure that they're not getting a free pass just because it's recycled water.
Okay, so that's OPEX.
Uh-huh.
Let's move on to the next piece of this puzzle.
Okay.
Regulatory asset value.
RAB.
RAB. Sounds important.
It is.
What is it?
It's basically the value of all the assets that are used to provide this service.
Okay.
So it plays a key role in figuring out how much the distributors can recover.
Through depreciation and all that?
Exactly, through depreciation and return on capital.
Okay.
Those other two components we talked about.
So higher RAV means more money for the distributors?
Potentially, yeah.
But hold on a second. Didn't we just say that a lot of these assets were transferred over for free?
Right.
So how do you put a value on something that was essentially given away?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to get into next.
That's a good cliffhanger.
Yeah, stay tuned.
All right.
So we left off with this RAV conundrum. How do you figure out the value of these assets that were basically given away for free?
Right. It's a tricky one.
Yeah.
And it actually caused a lot of debate.
Really?
The DOE initially, they proposed setting the initial RAB to 0
Zero.
for those transferred assets.
Wow, that seems kind of harsh. Like the distributors still have to maintain them and operate them?
Yeah, and that's exactly what they argued.
Okay.
They pushed back. They said, hey, we should use the net book value instead.
Okay, so the value that's on their accounting books.
Exactly.
So you've got the DOE on one side saying, look, we don't want these companies to be making windfall profits.
Right.
And then you've got the distributors on the other side saying, hey, this is the real value of the assets that we're now responsible for.
Exactly. And this is where that idea of true economic reality comes in. They
Yeah.
want to make sure that the depreciation and the return on capital calculations
Uh-huh.
are based on something solid,
Right.
not some inflated number.
So did they come to a solution?
They're still working on it.
Still working on it.
Yeah, it's a complex issue.
Yeah.
But the DOE, they're talking with ADHC.
Abu Dhabi Development Holding Company.
Yeah, the ultimate asset owner,
Okay.
to try and find a fair approach
Okay, so the RAV question mark remains.
for now.
Yeah, for now.
But let's move on to future investments.
Okay.
What happens if ADTC or ADDC needs to build a new pumping station?
Yeah, how does that work?
Well, those are capital expenditures or CapEx.
CapEx.
And initially the DOE, they wanted to do ex-ante reviews.
Ex ante. So before the project even starts?
Exactly.
Okay.
Assess it, approve it before any money is spent.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah, on paper it makes sense.
Yeah.
But in practice it wasn't really feasible.
Because
the businesses were so new.
right.
Doing these detailed reviews for every single project,
Yeah.
it just wasn't realistic.
Okay, so what did they do?
They switched to ex-post reviews.
So after the project's done?
Exactly. The distributors can go ahead and invest.
Okay.
But the DOE will check up on them afterwards.
So more flexibility up front, but the DOE is still keeping a close eye on things.
Exactly. They have the final say.
What happens if they decide that a project wasn't justified?
Well, they can adjust the MAR maximum allowed revenue
Right.
each year based on those reviews
Okay, so they can basically claw back some of that revenue.
if they need to. Keeps
Yeah.
everyone honest.
Yeah. Any examples of this in action?
Well, ADDC had a lot of CapEx planned for 2020.
Yeah, we saw that in the documents.
Really highlights how much investment this sector needs.
Yeah. New infrastructure, new pipelines, all of that.
All of it.
Okay, so we've covered OPEX, we've covered CapEx.
Uh-huh.
What about depreciation?
Ah, depreciation, the wear and tear.
Yeah, how do you factor that in?
Well, they use straight line depreciation.
Okay, I've heard of that.
It's a common method.
Yeah.
You basically spread the cost of the asset over its useful life.
So like a car, eventually you're going to have to replace it.
Exactly. You got to factor that in.
Okay.
So for new assets, they've decided on 40 years.
40 years. Okay.
But guess what? The
Yeah.
lifespan of those transferred assets, the ones with the uncertain RAV,
Oh, no.
still being debated.
Of course it is.
It never ends.
Nothing's simple when it comes to those transferred assets.
Nope.
Okay, so we've got OPEX, CapEx, depreciation.
Uh-huh.
Now let's talk about that final piece.
There are return on
So
cap.
this is about the return that investors expect
Exactly.
for putting their money into this.
It considers things like risk, the opportunity cost of investing elsewhere.
Right.
If you're going to put your money into recycled water,
Yeah.
you want to make sure you're getting a decent return.
Compared to other options.
Exactly.
Okay, so what did they decide was a fair return?
They landed on a WACC,
WACC,
weighted average cost of capital,
Okay.
of 4.6%.
4.6%
Yeah, so they expect investors to want at least that much
each year.
per year to invest in this sector.
Okay. And that WACC is factored into the return on capital calculation,
And exactly.
which is then added to the total revenue.
It all fits together.
It does. It all comes together in the
Like
end.
a beautiful puzzle.
Yeah, OPEX, CAPEX, depreciation, return on capital.
All the pieces
They all contribute to the picture of how much revenue these companies need.
to operate and to grow.
It sounds like the DOE is really carefully orchestrating all of this,
They're conducting the orchestra.
making sure everything's balanced and fair.
Yeah,
So let's talk about those price control calculations.
right.
How did they actually figure out how much ADC and ADDC were allowed to earn? Okay, so let's get into the actual price control calculations. How did they determine the revenue targets for ADC and ADDC?
Right. So remember, we're looking at a 4-year regulatory control period.
Right, from 2018 to 2021.
Exactly. But ADC and ADDC were just getting started in 2018 and 2019.
Yeah, those were kind of the early days.
Exactly. So the real focus of the price controls is on 2020 and 2021.
So the first 2 years were more of a trial run?
Yeah, you could say that they could recover their actual costs
Okay.
as long as they could justify them to the DOE.
Okay.
So it was more about demonstrating responsible spending and,
Yeah, proving that they could actually operate.
yeah, proving their competence. But for 2020 and 2021, the DOE had to set a concrete cap.
Right, a maximum allowed revenue.
Exactly, and that had to factor in all those elements we've been talking about.
OPEX, CAPEX, all of that.
The whole shebang.
So what were the final numbers? What did they determine was a fair revenue target?
All right, so for AADC, the fixed revenue component for 2020 was set at 48.79 million AED.
48.79 million?
But keep in mind, that's just the base amount.
Okay.
They can also recover some additional costs.
Right, like the dough license fee.
Exactly, and the cost of that wholesale water from ADSSC.
Okay, so 48.79 million for ADC. And what about ADDC?
So for ADDC, their fixed revenue was a bit higher,
Yeah, I imagine so.
151.62 million AED.
Wow, okay, so more than 3 times what ADC was allowed?
Right, reflects their larger service area.
And their big CAPEX plans.
Exactly.
So it seems proportionate given what we know about them.
Yeah, I think it's fair.
Okay, so with those revenue targets in place, ADDC and ADDC can start to operate efficiently and deliver on their promises.
Right, the stage is set.
The stage is set, but this is just the beginning.
It is.
We're seeing the first regulatory control period.
Right? It's a learning process.
Yeah, everyone's figuring things out as they go.
It's like they're learning to ride a bicycle.
A recycled water bicycle.
Exactly.
I had that.
But, as the sector matures, the data becomes more reliable.
Yeah.
The relationships between all these players, they solidify.
Right, ADSSC, ADSC, ADDC, the DOE.
Everyone working together.
It'll be interesting to see what happens next.
Yeah, what innovations come out of this?
Definitely a watch this space situation.
Absolutely.
The Abu Dhabi recycled water story is just getting started.
It's an exciting time.
It is. But before we wrap up, I have one final thought-provoking question for you.
Okay, shoot.
And for our listener,
I like it.
as recycled water becomes increasingly important in Abu Dhabi, how do you think the relationships between those key players will evolve?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Will it be more collaborative or more competitive or maybe a mix of both?
That's really interesting to think about, because as the stakes get higher
Yeah.
and the reliance on recycled water grows,
Yeah.
those dynamics are going to shift.
Well, this whole journey really highlights their commitment to building a sustainable future.
It does.
One where recycled water is at the center.
Yeah,
It's a really inspiring example for other water-stressed regions.
absolutely.
So thank you for guiding us through this deep dive.
My pleasure.
It's been an incredibly insightful exploration of this topic.
Yeah, it's a crucial topic.
And to you, dear listener, thank you for sending us all this material.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
Keep those questions flowing, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.